Hello, good evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to see so many friendly faces and so many new faces here at the wonderful Goulandris Museum. We're very pleased to have our second public presentation in Athens today. The name of our organization is ARCAthens, which stands for Artist Residency Center Athens. And we're very pleased to be hosting tonight our Fall 2019 Fellows, Curatorial Fellow Miranda Lash, and Visual Art Fellow Tomashi Jackson. Tonight's program will introduce you to the wonderful work of our fellows, and it will be followed by they will do an audiovisual presentation, which will be followed by a conversation. Our fellows will be answering your questions. I hope you all received a program. Inside the program should have an index card, and maybe you should have a pencil as well. So please don't be shy. Whatever question you're interested in comes up, please write it down. Once the audiovisual presentation is over, we'll come around, collect the questions, and we'll answer them for you. So I first want to thank you for joining us. And I'd also like to thank everyone who helped organize this event, particularly the Basil and Elise Goulandris Foundation, which has so generously provided space and support for this presentation. Athenians, including myself, have been eagerly awaiting for this new museum for many years and with great excitement, and we're thrilled to be introducing our fellows here. The museum is a much-needed addition to this culturally rich city, and if you haven't yet had a chance to visit the collection, I strongly encourage you to do so. Our presentation and discussion tonight takes place in conjunction with our second residency here in Athens. We're a nonprofit organization from New York City. We're supported mostly by people like you, and our mission is to immerse talented scholars in the Athenian community and to provide them with the financial support and structure so that they can develop and enrich their research, build bridges, and cross-pollinate advanced ideas through their relationships with local Athenian community, which I, as well as many others, believe is uniquely dynamic. Last time I spoke to some of you at the Acropolis Museum, I shared with you a vision that is alive in many people here in Athens, as well as in the Greek diaspora, that Greece and Athens ought to be a global center for creation, scholarship, and academia. And ARCAthens aims to provide a positive contribution to an already energized, pulsing city. I'm thrilled to see that in 2019, this idea of residencies exists with many others. There are several new programs active in Athens, and we have already begun dialogues and collaborations with them. I look forward to many more residencies opening up, supporting artists, enriching dialogue, and collaborating in this great city. Before we jump into tonight's program, I want to thank everyone who help make our program a reality. The success of our program is rooted in hard work and service of our excellent team. Among them, our talented fellows, our board of directors, our advisory council, and our staff, with a particular note of thanks to our communications director, Maggie Lamb, who's joining us tonight here from Madrid, and our assistant director, Iris Plaitakis, or Iris Mu, as the fellows now lovingly call her. I'd also like to thank all the funders, particularly the Macomb Foundation, and our funding patrons, the Daphne and George Chatsopoulos Fund, the Hellas Foundation, Louis Katsos, Charlie Kyriakos Perperidis, and Dr. Rhoda Plakoyannis. Special thanks also to Nikos Lazaridis for providing us with some delicious wine for the reception that's following. Now, with no further ado, I'm incredibly pleased to introduce our fellows, both exceptionally talented, dynamic women pushing the boundaries of their fields. We're going to start with Miranda Lash, who is the recipient of the ARCAthens Curatorial Fellowship for Fall 2019 program. Lash is the curator of contemporary art at the Speed Art Museum and a board member of the Joan Mitchell Foundation. Her recent exhibition at the Speed include Yinka Shonibari, The American, Kelty Ferris, Open, Bruce Connor, Forever and Ever. Lash is presenting curator of the exhibition currently on view at the Speed, Ebony Patterson. I have to wear my glasses. Sorry about that. I tried. Ebony G. Patterson, While the Dew is Still on the Roses, organized by the Perez Art Museum in Miami. Her 2017 exhibition, Southern Accent, Seeking the American South in Contemporary Art, co-organized by Trevor Schoonmaker, garnered praise from sources including the New York Times, Hyperallergic, and NPR. Lash was recently a member of the Artistic Directors Council for the International Triennial Prospect 4 in New Orleans. From 2008 to 2014, Lash was the founding curator of modern and contemporary art at the New Orleans Museum of Art. There she curated over 20 exhibitions, including the large-scale traveling retrospective exhibition, Mel Chin, Rematch, and the exhibitions Rashad Newsom, King of Arms, Katie Holton, Drawn to the Edge, Swoon, Thalassa, Wayne Gonzalez, Light to Dark, Dark to Light, and Parallel Universe, Quintron and Miss Pussycat at City Park. I had the pleasure of seeing a couple of these exhibitions during my visits to New Orleans, and I'm really pleased that Miranda is here with us. I should also say that Miranda Lash also presented several artists' first solo museum exhibitions in the United States, including at the Venice Biennale Silver Lion awardee Camille Enro in Camille Enro Cities of Wise, and the British artist Marcus Coates, Animal Instincts. Lash's essays have been published in the Harvard Journal, Res, Anthropology and Aesthetics, and the anthology Baroque Tendencies in Contemporary Art. Please let's all welcome Miranda Lash.
Okay, thank you so much, Aristides. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Kalispera? Yes. Before I launch into my talk, I feel like I want to give my own thanks to the incredible team of ARCAthens, Aristides Logotheris, Iris Plaitaki, and Maggie Lamb, as well as Eleni and Joshua. I feel like you've constructed a deeply thoughtful, deeply rich, and deeply diverse experience for myself and my colleague Tomashi Jackson. And I feel like it's fair to say it's been life-changing, and I'm honored to be here. And I also want to extend a special thanks to Adipose CVC for offering up your space and giving us a haven, a little creative paradise for us to discuss our ideas and live and contemplate other possibilities in our lives. So thank you for that. As a curator, I've worked in a number of different institutions, but the focus of my practice has been working in city museums. And I feel deeply committed to the role of civic institutions as places not just to show art, but to engage deeply with their communities. And I realize as I go through the slides, and there's a lot of, oh, there I am, hi. As I go through the slides, I feel like I'm going to show you lots of different types of projects, and in part the diversity comes from being receptive to where I am and the issues that are meaningful to the museums that I work at. And I never saw this as a constraint, but rather I feel like institutions are at their most powerful and they're most effective when they allow the communities to inform what they do. So you can show the very best art and you can bring in the very best ideas, but there's a responsiveness that I think makes the interaction where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, between people and art. It gives it another level of meaning. That's a strain in my practice. I consider the foremost role of museums to serve artists and help others hear their voice. And on that note, I feel like I want to also thank the many artists that I've done studio visits with while in Athens. You've been consistently generous with your time and ideas, and it's been an honor for me to partake in that. So I'll just start off by showing you a picture of New Orleans Museum of Art. As Aristides mentioned, I was the founding curator of modern and contemporary art at this institution, where I started in 2007. Maybe it's worth pointing out it's a neoclassical building. This is one of many, many, many in the United States, inspired by the legacy of Greek architecture. NOMA, to provide context for why I moved to New Orleans and why I started there, I feel like it's relevant to explain the after effects of Hurricane Katrina and the flooding and the levee failures which followed. Prior to coming to NOMA, I worked at a private collection known as the Menil Collection in Houston with a modernist focus. In 2005, there was massive levee failures in New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina, which caused a devastating flood throughout the city. So I show you this map because I think not everyone knows the extent to which the flooding took place and the devastation it wrought. So I'm essentially showing you that 80% of the city went underwater. The levels you're seeing are the levels of where the water level stood 4 days after the levee rupture. So in other words, there were part of the city that were over 15 feet submerged underwater, the deepest blue. I don't know what that is in meters, but it's about 3 times my height. It was catastrophic on many levels. At least 1,400 people died immediately, many more in the aftermath. Many people, the vast majority of the city, lost their homes, many of which them also lost their jobs because of the extent of the economic devastation. And in the United States, when you lose your job, you also lose your health insurance. So it was a critical time for the citizens of the city as well as the institution. So NOMA, that museum that I just showed you, it was located right here, about here in City Park, which also flooded. To give you a sense of how high the water came, you see how it's elevated on these steps right there? The water actually came to the very top step, but did not spill over into the building. So thankfully, the collection was spared, but the rush of water into the park was so strong that it cracked the foundation underneath the museum. Before the storm, there were 110 employees. After the storm, there were 8. I started in 2007 when I was about the 50th employee to be hired. So about as in the process of coming back. I was the first employee at the museum that was not a Katrina survivor, which actually was a role I took very seriously because a huge part of my job when I first got there was actually literally to listen to the stories of what my colleagues had experienced and try to understand what had happened. Fascinatingly, the museum, at the advisement of many other arts leaders, decided that was the moment to launch a contemporary program. So believe it or not, this museum in 2005 was already 95 years old. And they decided that one of the aspects of returning to the city and having an effective recovery would be to start exploring contemporary art. And I mentioned this because it was very clear to me upon embarking on this program that contemporary art was seen as a survival strategy. And part of the overall goal of New Orleans to not just survival wasn't actually the ultimate goal. The goal was to thrive. The goal was to come back as a city. It was a city where jazz was born and which really prized its cultural riches. So the goal was to not just be able to come back, but actually come back with some kind of cultural force. So I did a lot of different projects at NOMA. I'll just show you a sampling of some of them. part of being responsive, as I mentioned before, was paying attention just to what was going on in the city. There were actually quite a number of artists in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina that came to produce art in the city and contribute what they could culturally. Some of those were street artists. We had Banksy and a lot in town, JR, and Swoon, whose work you're seeing here, or her also goes by Callie Curry. She created wheat paste artworks all over the city, focusing specifically on areas that have been particularly hard hit. She partnered with a artist-run organization in the city known as New Orleans Airlift. And together they worked on the idea of creating a musical village or a music box, the idea of a house or a complex of structures in New Orleans that you could actually play as you move through the house. So in other words, the house would be a musical instrument. And I thought what they were doing was so exciting. I wanted to invite them to participate in doing a project at the museum. And after a number of conversations, we agreed that they would do a site-specific commission. They would create a sculpture. And this is the Lhasa, this is what you're seeing, a sea goddess, sort of rising out of the waves. Some people ask me why a sea goddess. A lot of it has to do with Louisiana and New Orleans' relationship to water, the fact that the seafood industry, shrimps, crabs, oysters are a huge part of the economy. So what you're seeing on her chest are, for example, crabs, the bodies of, here's eels, manta rays, the aquatic life that sustains the city. So we presented it as a suspended sculpture right as you entered the museum. This was the main entrance to the space. But it was also a platform for the community to learn about the work that New Orleans Airlift was doing. And they were called Airlift actually because they were dedicated, actually not unlike on ARCAthens, to bringing New Orleans artists out of the city and being exposed to other experiences and bringing artists from outside New Orleans to the city to get to know it better. So that was, this is us sort of preparing the piece to go up. There's Callie, and there we are trying to just get it ready. She preferred to work through the night most days, so this is, I don't know what time that is when we took that photo, but it was a wonderful process actually, where the mounting of the sculpture was generally during the day fully visible. We didn't try to hide the process from our audience. Another project I'll mention that I think goes along the lines of being responsive to dialogues in your community was a project I did with Camille Unruh, who's a French artist based in New York. She won the Venice Biennale Silver Lion a few years back, but this is before all that. And she was fascinated to learn about the history and the legacy of French-speaking tribes, Native American tribes in Louisiana. So some of you may or may not know, there are a number of tribes located on the south edges of Louisiana that their native language has been French for almost 200 years. They traded early with the French, they intermarried with the French, they consider French part of their official culture. A number of these tribes, including the Homa, have not received federal recognition. And essentially what that means is the US government does not recognize them formally as Native American, even though throughout the 20th century they experienced legalized discrimination. So for example, they were not allowed to attend school with white children. They had to go to Indian school, but they do not receive to this day federal benefits such as designated tribal lands, designated federal scholarships, things like that. So what they are currently seeking and continue to seek is federal recognition, which has very specific requirements. And Camille was interested in engaging with this tribe on helping them better articulate, or maybe I shouldn't say better articulate, getting to the, working with them on articulating how they define being Homa. What does it mean to be Homa? So it was actually a project directly between the artist and tribal council, and both voices had equal weight. So we worked directly with the chiefs on every word of text in the exhibition. on how the exhibition was constructed. And this is a slot actually from the Tribal Nations official office. I love this phrase, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen, because one of the arguments that the US government has put against the Homa was that their tradition was oral and not written, and therefore not as official. So Camille documented young Homa women engaging in traditional dance. A lot of her installations actually reflect the contemporary ways that people articulate their identity. So in other words, for a lot of people, and I think you might be the same, if you're asked to explain who you are and who your family is, a lot of people bring out their phones and they show you photos of their families. So for example, when she asked people to explain, well, what makes you Homa, often the tool that was used most commonly was the phone. Here's my family, here are photographs of archival images. She included laptops as part of her installation as well. And here she was inspired by the history of the narrow boats that have been traditionally used to navigate the waterways called pirogues. They're these deliberately narrow so you can get through the bayous. And she designed a pirogue for the installation that bisected her art and then a related gallery with basketry. And the reason, in conjunction with Camille's show, we did an exhibition of craftwork and baskets by the Homa tribe was because they articulated to us that something that would help us in the path towards federal recognition is having formal institutional recognition of their basket-making traditions. So we put together for the very first time an institutional history of basket-making traditions for the Homa. And this was important to them. One of the reasons they were interested in the project, as well as working with Camille. But I say that in the sense that like it wasn't just about sending an artist into a community to learn about them. We also wanted to provide something to the community. Next, I'll show you work by Rashad Newsom, which I feel like every artist I invite to New Orleans, or really to anywhere, they have obviously very different approaches to the very same place. Rashad was born and raised in New Orleans. He grew up there, and his art was more specifically interested in a number of things, including the tradition of rap coming out of New Orleans, Dirty South rap, artists like Lil Wayne, Manny Fresh, Juvenile, and so capturing the legacy of that music coming out of New Orleans, as well as Mardi Gras tradition. And so some of you may know that there's a huge carnival tradition in New Orleans. It's very French influenced, and full of elaborate floats and full of parade kings and queens and crews. And this is a tradition that is almost 200 years old. So his art reflected the more Baroque side of New Orleans. He used literally Baroque period frames and covered them in sort of his own lacquers and chrome textures. And his collages, this is a detailed collage that he created, were directly inspired by musicians coming out of New Orleans, like Lil Wayne, like Manny Fresh. He wanted to we not only displayed the collages, but he wanted to create a procession called King of Arms, where he was in the role of the king. So here's Rashad in front of the museum in a custom-wrapped Lamborghini. And this parade of opulence was made in direct emulation of a Mardi Gras parade, of a carnival parade, and a procession which took place in front of the museum. So here he is with his royal accoutrements. The symbols that you see on his jackets are fleur-de-lis, which is the symbol of New Orleans because of the French legacy, the magnolia, a flower associated with the South, among other things. This is his royal procession, where this is once again the central atrium of the museum, where he has worked with, in New Orleans, there are many bands, which often high school musicians, but sometimes other musicians who present music, and so he hired local bands. These are high school bands right here, as well as Mardi Gras Indians. You can kind of see them in the corner as part of this procession. it wasn't just a simple act of self-aggrandizement. That's way too simple an interpretation of what he did. I think it's as a backdrop, as context, important to understand that a lot of the Mardi Gras traditions in New Orleans have a legacy of racism even within themselves. There are, to this day in 2019, still Mardi Gras crews in New Orleans that won't allow members who are Black to participate. So Mardi Gras is a very festive, very long affair in New Orleans. It takes place over a month, but there's built into these traditions legacies of racism. There are Black crews, and some of them very famous, like Zulu, which, Louis Armstrong, the jazz musician, was one year king of Zulu. But to articulate, for him to position himself in a position of royalty and to demand respect and honor, this was a very deliberate political act. So it was part of a live performance that he then recorded and made into subsequent video pieces. And then again, just to shift gears from there, I think one of the goals of the talk was to give you a sense of range in my practice. I've shown you a couple specifically commissioned works that I've created at NOMA, but now I'll talk about another big project I did, which was a retrospective of an artist, and this is Mel Chin. A month ago, he won the MacArthur Genius Award. I was so happy for him and deeply pleased. Mel is an artist that has been practicing for about 40 years and really an innovator in the realm of dealing with ecological issues, environmental issues, and the integration of art and science. So his work in terms of incorporating scientists into his practice was actually so revolutionary that it was questioned by the National Endowment for the Arts in the States of whether is this even art? Shouldn't this just be science? And he really made an argument for an artist using scientific research as part of their practice. I think it's important to acknowledge this because research-based practice is so widely accepted now as normal and as part of what an artist does, but Mel was really at the forefront. So this is a piece he did called Revival Field, where he collaborated with scientists on the fact that there were plants which were believed to have the capability to soak up lead through their roots and help diminish the toxicity of certain landfill sites. So what you're seeing is him growing several species of corn and the last bee, which is a sort of a weed, a specific type of weed that was known for its capabilities to absorb lead through the roots. And he made these into several works of art. This is a maquette of the design of Revival Field. But it was all done directly in conversation with U.S. Department of Agriculture scientists. So in other words, the research didn't just live in the art gallery. It actually lived in the, within governmental institutions and within scientific practice. I chose to work with him because he did a lot of groundbreaking work in bringing attention to lead awareness, lead poisoning in the city of New Orleans. In addition to the flooding, as I mentioned to you, associated with Hurricane Katrina, there were, in many parts of the city, exceptionally high levels of lead in the soil, in part because of lead paint and lead gasoline used in cars before lead was outlawed. We know now that lead poisoning in children can have very damaging effects to the brain. So he basically took a house that had been wrecked during Katrina and made it into what he called the safe house. In other words, a space where it's safe to discuss issues, safe to meet. He knew that he needed to raise money for the government to take action upon this issue, so he garnered attention for this issue by asking people to draw money, to draw dollar bills. So in other words, if you were to open the door of this safe house, which by the way swung all the way open like a giant circuit, like an actual safe, you would find the walls lined with money. And what it was guarding and advocating for was the safety of the citizens. So now I work at the Speed. I've been working there now for 5 years. It was a hard task leaving New Orleans, but I was invited to launch the contemporary program at the Speed Art Museum. This gives you a sense of what the building looks like. This is 2 floors dedicated to contemporary art, and it's been my pleasure to bring projects now to them. This just gives you a sense of our collection galleries. I'll just mention one more project that I worked on just to give you a sense of my work at this Speed, because I think we're getting low on time. But Southern Accent, Seeking the American South in Contemporary Art. I wanted to focus on, in this show, which was a large show, 60 artists, mythologies associated with the American South. So have you heard about, I don't know if you've heard about the American South, but it's very quickly usually defined as a region of the U.S. below the Mason-Dixon line where slavery was legal until 1865. It's typically associated with lower education levels, higher levels of poverty, but even positive stereotypes like, oh, life there is just slower, people there are friendlier, people talk, people have a certain accent, hence the Southern accent. I thought, to me, it was amazing that this region of the country had simultaneously produced some of America's greatest cultural fruits. It's the birthplace of jazz, of blues, of rock and roll, of country, and yet also some of its darkest chapters, legalized slavery and later legalized segregation. So how do we unpack these processes? This is where I think art can be very effective. So you're looking at a piece by Thornton Dial, a really important artist who has had shows at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but for the majority of his career was essentially given the label of being a self-taught artist, i.e. not a formally trained artist. And in the US, sometimes we use the phrase outsider artist to sort of articulate this difference, which is often racialized between artists who have had formal training and artists who have not. So this project continued in terms of the labor of trying to do away with those boundaries. It included historic images of the South, such as, for example, the photographer Gordon Parks's documentation of legalized segregation. So this is part of his well-known segregation series that appeared in Life magazine in 1956. Even though segregation was but legally, technically outlawed in the 1950s in the US, its legacy is so strong and so felt on so many levels. I felt like it was important to revisit images from this time period to talk about the American South, and also to include images of the ways the South has changed. So, for example, the artists articulating the fact that now many rural populations in the South have gotten so small due to migration to urban areas. Most people in the South now live in big cities, by the way, like Atlanta and Houston. So many rural communities have gotten so small that the government is actually decommissioning zip codes. So in other words, mailing codes for sending mail to certain towns. This is an example of a post office in a rural area of Alabama that's been shut down because that region no longer has its own zip code because the population has gotten so tiny. And I also wanted to highlight artists who are attempting to present alternative visions of the South. So this is work by the photographer Catherine Opie, a really important American photographer who, as part of her trek through the U.S., specifically sought to document queer communities in the South and the havens that they had created for themselves in different cities. So this couple is from Durham, North Carolina. This Skylar Fine, it's a black flag, American flag. So black flag, traditionally the symbol of anarchy, highlighting the fact that there's a huge punk community in New Orleans, many of them self-proclaimed anarchists. This was important to articulate because not everyone associates punk music with the South. Many people associate blues and jazz, but not necessarily punk. And the flag is covered with cuisines from the South, like crawfish, oysters, okra, collard greens, pork shoulder, things like that. And then, of course, artists like Kara Walker creating videos about essentially psychosexual power dynamics, the problem of generations of rape and of forced labor and manipulation, except she does it through a surrealist lens, so we included that. We also included video documentation of the continuance of the KKK. This is a video shot by the artist Michael Galinsky in 1986, in part to articulate that the KKK didn't go away in the 1950s or 60s. It was alive and well in the 1980s. Unfortunately, it continues to resurface. but also to show that even when there were marches in the 1980s, this took place in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, there were citizens of Chapel Hill protesting protesting these parades. So in other words, not all Southerners were totally okay with this. There were actually just as many people in the crowd depicted that were unhappy that the KKK was there. And then, just to buzz through it, I'll mention Douglas Bourgeois, highlighting again the cultural fruits of the South. This is the famous singer Irma Thomas being glorified in this image, but there's signs of Katrina's all around her. Like, for example, the emptied out refrigerator. If you lose power during a hurricane, you have to dump all your food. And then the fact that her pants are soaked with mud from walking through a flooded landscape. And then this is the artist Diego Camposeco, who wanted to articulate through his art the fact that Latinos, people of Hispanic descent, are one of the fastest growing communities in the South. So here he is depicting himself, his name is Diego, and he is depicting himself as the American cartoon character Diego, working in a tobacco field, because most of the agricultural work in the South is done by Latinos. So how are we doing on time? Is it? Yeah, okay. So I think I'll stop there so that I can turn it over to my colleague, but I look forward to answering questions. Okay.
Thank you so much, Miranda. We didn't even get to Yinka Shonibari or Ebony Patterson, so many other incredible shows you've curated, but maybe we can talk about them later. I've been told that some new people have come in since we began, so to remind you, in your program there's an index card, and you were given hopefully a pencil. Please do write any questions you might have for Miranda or Tomashi, and we will read those questions after Tomashi's presentation. Now I would like to introduce Tomashi Jackson, who is an artist that I've been interested in since I first saw her work at the amazing exhibition at Mass MoCA a couple years ago. Visual artist Tomashi Jackson is the recipient of the ARCAthens Visual Arts Fellowship for a Fall 2019 program. Jackson is a multidisciplinary artist who uses the formal properties of color perception as an aesthetic strategy to investigate the value of human life in public space. Jackson was born in Houston, Texas in 1980 and grew up in Los Angeles, California. She received her MFA in painting and printmaking from Yale University School of Art in 2016, with Pedro Barbado there as professor, who was just here a couple weeks ago and one of our beloved advisory council members. Tomashi earned her Master's of Science in Art, Culture, and Technology from the MIT School of Architecture and Planning in 2012, and her BFA from the Cooper Union in 2010. Tomashi is represented by Tilton Gallery in New York. Her recent exhibitions include a solo show at Tilton Gallery, Time Out of Mind, and a group exhibition at Matthew Marks Gallery in Los Angeles, ICA at VCU, Charles Moffat Gallery in New York, and the Lehman Maupin Gallery in New York, as well as David Castillo in Miami. Tomashi's work was also included in the Whitney Biennial 2019 in New York City, and in Hinge Pictures, 8 women artists occupy the third dimension at the Contemporary Art Center in New Orleans. Her first solo museum exhibition, Interstate Love Song, took place at the Zuckerman Museum of Art in Kennesaw, Georgia, and her work has been included in numerous group exhibitions, including Give and Take, highlighting recent acquisitions at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, and in The Abstract at Mass MoCA, North Adams in 2017, the show that I saw and fell in love with her work. So please, let's all welcome Tomashi Jackson.
Hi. Ευχαριστώ for coming. I'm going to try not to be as nervous as I am, and I'm going to say some thank yous, and while I'm doing that, let you see the other things that we didn't get to see in Miranda's talk. I would like to thank the entire ARCAthens team of visionaries, directors and advisors, mentors for creating this residency and fellowship, and for inviting me to be a part of its first year. I'd especially like to thank Elise, Aristides, Maggie, Eleni, and Josh, without whom none of this would be possible. I've felt things here that I've never felt before. I'm so inspired by the people we've met and the vibrance of this beautiful city. I would also like to thank the wonderful people of Atopos Center for Visual Culture for housing us in their historic space and caring for us so graciously. And finally, I would like to thank the gallerists. Oh, no, not finally. I'd like to thank my gallerists at Tilton Gallery and in New York and Night Gallery in Los Angeles for supporting me from the United States during the 6-week ARCAthens Fellowship. Finally, I'd like to thank the amazing staff of the Basil and Elise Goulandris. I'm so afraid of mispronouncing everything right now. Goulandris Foundation for hosting this evening and for having us all in the space during this inaugural month of activity in this beautiful space. Thank you for having us. All right, so let's get to it. That's me. My work visualizes public narratives and the implications of past and present through painting, printmaking, sculpture, video, and performance. Tonight, I'll discuss projects on voting rights, housing, transportation, and education in the United States. I entered this summer of 2019 with an idea for my newest body of work. I have questions about voting rights in the United States, and I decided, I gotta set my time. Because we're gonna look at some videos at the end, so I can't show you stills for very long. All right, here we go. So I came here with an idea. I have questions about voting rights in the United States, and I decided to focus on voting for research and visualization through my work, with a specific focus on the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the contemporary experience of voting in the United States. I brought books with me on to help me with this research. On the matter of democracy in the United States, I brought the autobiography of Martin Luther King, Jr., edited by Clayton Carson. And to welcome you into my thought process, I'm going to read from the text, from page 166 first, from the chapter, a chapter entitled, the chapter on the Albany movement. Tears welled up in my heart and my eyes last week as I surveyed the shambles of what had been the Shady Grove Baptist Church in Leesburg, Georgia. I had been awakened shortly after daybreak by my executive assistant, the Reverend Wyatt T. Walker, who informed me that a Southern Negro SNCC. The acronym is SNCC, and because I'm nervous, I'm not remembering the full acronym, but we'll get into that later. Wyatt T. Walker, who informed me that a SNCC staffer had just called and reported that the church where the organization had been holding voting clinics and registration classes had been destroyed by fire and/or dynamite. The naked truth is that whether the object of the Negro community's efforts are directed at lunch counters or interstate buses, First Amendment privileges or pilgrimages of prayer, school desegregation or the right to vote, he meets an implacable foe in the Southern white racist. No matter what it is we seek, if it has to do with full citizenship, self-respect, human dignity, and borders on changing the Southern way of life, the Negro stands little chance, and if any, of securing the approval, consent, or tolerance of the segregationist white South. Exhibit A, the charred remains of the Shady Grove Baptist Church, Lee County, Georgia. This is the terrible cost of the ballot in the Deep South. That was from a newspaper column in September 1, 1962. And then I'll also read from the chapter titled The Expanding Struggle. These are the papers of King that were organized and edited and published after his death. Give us the ballot. Yeah, give us the ballot. Our most urgent request to the President of the United States and every member of Congress is to give us the right to vote. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer plead to the federal government for passage of an anti-lynching law. We will, by the power of our vote, write the law on the statute books of the South and bring an end to the dastardly acts of the hooded perpetrators of violence. Give us the ballot, and we will transform the salient misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs into the calculated good deeds of orderly citizens. If the executive and legislative branches of the government were as concerned about the protection of our citizenship rights as the federal courts have been, then the transition from a segregated to an integrated society would be infinitely smoother. But we so often look to Washington in vain for this concern. In the midst of the tragic breakdown of law and order, the executive branch of government is all too silent and apathetic. In the midst of the desperate need for civil rights legislation, the legislative branch of the government is all too stagnant and hypocritical. The dearth of positive leadership from the federal government is not confined to one particular, is not confined to one particular political party. Both parties have betrayed the cause of justice. The Democrats have betrayed it by capitulating to the prejudices and undemocratic practices of the Southern Dixiecrats. The Republicans have betrayed it by capitulating to the blatant hypocrisy of right-wing reactionary Northerners. These men so often have a high blood pressure of words and an anemia of deeds. On the matter of my hometown of Los Angeles, the Black community, my family, and the lived experience of perversions of the democratic myth in the United States, I brought Dark Alliance, the CIA, the Contras, and the crack cocaine explosion, written by the late journalist Gary Webb, a harrowing true story that revealed to the world how the administrations of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush funded CIA-backed Nicaraguan Contras via a Bay Area drug ring that sold tons of cocaine to Los Angeles street gangs for more than a decade. Webb's text, quote, demonstrates how our government knowingly allowed massive exchange of drugs and money, massive amounts of drugs and money to change hands at the expense of our communities. The devastation of this plague is difficult to comprehend. Both texts were published in 1998. That's my family, and we were affected by that plague enormously. So when making work focused on researching the 1954 Supreme Court decision on Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, the case that formally outlawed Jim Crow laws and segregated schools in the United States, this image of the Supreme Court came up a lot, the image of which is based on Athenian architecture, specifically the Parthenon. Spending time with Elise and Miranda inside of the civic and religious centers of ancient Athens, the Agora and the Acropolis, I cannot help but be overwhelmed by the grand beauty of it all, the extraordinary ecosystem of assembly and participation within the site of the Athenian direct democracy experiment. I was reminded of the mythic democracy that we're taught to revere in the United States in rhetoric and the glaring contradictory experiences of perversions of that myth. So I've been piecing these things together in the studio at ARCAthens, building surfaces that will visualize this conflict. This work will be exhibited in January in Los Angeles at Night Gallery. This body of work is called Forever My Lady. Love songs have arisen as significant this summer. While at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, that all artists in the room, all young artists, I hope you're ready to apply. The application opens next month. That's here at ARCAthens. So while I was at Skowhegan, I joined a boy band. I wasn't expecting that to happen. I don't really have many very clear words about what's happening with this. I think of it as the pursuit of love in its absence. There are songs that my mother and I sang together in the car, driving in Los Angeles and at home, songs that my friends and I sang together and that we all know. I enjoy lip syncing these songs, and they keep finding their way into the making of my work. That's in the studio at Skowhegan. I'm really in trouble with time, so I'm gonna try to speed through this. So my recent solo show at Tilton Gallery in New York City and my contribution to this year's Whitney Biennial exhibition focused on a specific history of housing dispossession in New York City, where a village that held the highest concentration of Black property ownership in New York City in the 1800s was demolished in 1857 through what was then the new and innovative use of eminent domain for the construction of Central Park. This history collides with the contemporary use of what's called the third-party transfer program being used by the current mayoral administration of Bill de Blasio to seize fully paid-for properties only in Black and brown communities in New York City. Oh, this is one of my favorite pieces. I love the awnings and the architecture and the daily residential architecture around this beautiful city, and you will see why over and over again, actually. So these are the pieces from that show. I use the photographs from the journalism. I was following journalists Kelly Mena, Stephen Witt, and Shubhasa Berg, as they were the only journalists in the city covering the story of people losing their homes and trying to get them back, literally waking up to notices on their doors saying that they no longer own their property, and if they wanted to stay there, they had to pay rent to a not-for-profit organization that's actually a shell company for a developer. It's unreal. And as soon as I started reading about that, I began thinking about what little I knew about Seneca Village. So my work tends to operate as an opportunity for me to ask questions about things that I don't know enough about. This is the work from the Whitney. All right, Interstate Love Song. This body of work focused on transportation and voting in and around Atlanta, Georgia, where decades of voting referenda and also innovatively racist voting systems that were created to devalue the votes of residents in urban city centers after desegregation and prioritize the votes of rural areas with fewer voters, specifically the county unit voting system. This was my first awning. I was really excited about this. So there's the restriction of public transportation funding and expansion to maintain segregation and whites-only suburban areas. And I wanted to show you what videos look like when they're installed the way I like them. These are more works from Interstate Love Song, where I used Georgia red clay, the famous Georgia red clay, as a part of my palette. And then finally, education and desegregation. What began as research on the history of school desegregation in the United States eventually opened up into an exploration of the language of color, color perception, and its influence on the value of human life in public space, with a particular focus on the lives of children, Black children in the United States. Investigating color as a formal chromatic theory and as a societal construct of value. Key to my growth at this time was the close reading of Joseph Albers's Interaction of Color and the color problems therein. And this is like the clearest example of that. The two video collage works that I'm about to show you were born of this body of work made between 2014 and 2016. The first, and I have to tell you this. I was just gonna drop this on you, but I have to tell you this first. So the first is an excerpt of what's called Self-Portrait, Tale of Two Michaels, or Untitled Self-Portrait, Tale of Two Michaels. The two Michaels being Michael Brown Jr., who was killed by police officer Darren Wilson, and Michael McDonald, the successful, world-famous singer-songwriter, famous for his work with the Doobie Brothers and Steely Dan. Both Michaels grew up in Ferguson, Missouri. I'm gonna hop in real quick and just remind people, please write on the cards. I mean, we have plenty to talk about, but it's really fun to be able to actually steer our question and answers with your actual question and answers. So please write down your thoughts. All right, so Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson. Michael McDonald grew up in Ferguson, and he's still alive. The moving imagery. At the time I was asking myself, can a video function as a painting? So that's kind of what's at stake in the first piece, which is an excerpt. It's only a 3-minute excerpt. And then the second piece was made in Houston, Texas at Project Row Houses. Houston is the location of the first successful case of school desegregation in 1949. After a melee at a Dallas, the summer of 2015, after a melee at a Dallas suburban neighborhood pool party where local police attacked a group of mostly Black teenagers, I thought that I would go to that site and reenact the stress positions endured by two girls who were there that day. However, after a 28-year-old black woman scholar named Sandra Bland died in police custody, was found dead in a cell 2 days after being taken into custody, after being snatched from her car and arrested near Prairie View University, one of the schools that I was actually going to go to ask questions as a part of my research, driving around by myself. So after she was found dead in a cell, I did not feel it was safe for me to do these performances outside. Rick Lowe, Ryan Dennis, and then summer artist resident William Cordova offered me studio space among the row houses to complete the final piece, Vibrating Boundaries, The Law of the Land. This work, and trigger warning, this work incorporates the complete recording of Sandra Bland's arrest and the assault that she suffered at the hands of a former officer, Brian Encinia. Let's do it.
Vibrating boundaries and forced contours. As a deception, this effect is related to our earlier experience in which two colors appeared as 3 or 4 colors. However, the additional illusionary colors often are hard to define as their hue. They often appear as shadow on one side of the boundary and as light reflected on the other side. Or sometimes this vibration presents just a duplication or triplication of the boundary line. The conditions for these varying effects occur between colors, which are contrasting in their hues, but also close or similar in light intensity. Though this effect refers to the after image, its physio and psychological function apparently seems not to have been clarified. Often, under the same conditions, it is perceived by some people and not by others. It is visible and not visible with or without glasses, or similarly with interchanging of near and far focus. This initially exciting effect also feels aggressive and often even uncomfortable to our eyes. One finds it rarely used except for a screaming effect in advertising and as a result in its unpleasant, disliked, and avoided.
Can you read out something else? Anything else?
Okay.
You see anything else that looks interesting?
Sure. On teaching color, some color terms. In the previous chapters, we have presented a studio course, or if you prefer, a laboratory or workshop course, which opposes an administrative attitude of theory and practice. Naturally, practice is not preceded but followed by theory. Such study promotes a more lasting teaching and learning through experience. Its aim is development of creativeness realized in discovery and invention. The criteria of creativity or flexibility being imagination and fantasy. Altogether, it promotes thinking in situations, a new educational concept unfortunately little known and less cultivated so far. We have described up to now the basic color problems to be solved and have presented them in a logical sequence in which each problem prepares four following ones. The color plates selected for reproduction in this edition are strictly studied, that is, experimental tryouts. They aim at one distinct effect only, which at the time was given as an exercise obligatory for all members of the class. These exercises are not meant to illustrate or to decorate or beautify something, but aim at the development of the ability to produce the desired colored effect. This reiterates our disbelief in self-expression, either as a way of study or as it aims in schools. After too much non-teaching, non-learning, and in consequence non-seeing in too many art activities, it is time to advocate, again, a basic step-by-step learning which promotes recognition of insight coming from experience and evaluation resulting from comparison. This
Okay, man. You okay?
I'm waiting on you. This is your job. I'm waiting on you. What do you want me to do?
You seem very irritated.
I am. I really am. But I feel like this cap is what I'm getting the ticket for. I was getting out of your way. You were speeding up, tailing me. So I move over and you stop me. So yeah, I am a little irritated, but that doesn't stop you from giving me a ticket. So.
Are you done?
You asked me what was wrong and I told you.
Okay.
So now I'm done, yeah.
Okay. You mind putting out your cigarette, please? If you don't mind.
I'm in my car. Why do I have to put out my cigarette?
Well, you can step on out now.
I don't have to step out of my car.
Step out of the car. Step out of the car.
No, you don't have the right.
Step out of the car.
You do not have the right to do that.
I do have the right. Now step out or I will remove
I
you.
refuse to talk to you other than to identify myself.
Step out or I will remove
I
you.
am getting removed for a failure.
Step out or I will remove you. I'm giving you a lawful order. Get out of the car now or I'm going to remove you.
And I'm calling my
I'm going to yank you out of here.
Okay, you gonna yank me out my car?
Get out.
Okay. All right.
25.
Let's do this.
Yeah, we're going to.
Yeah. Don't touch me.
Get out of the car.
Don't touch me. I'm not under arrest. You don't have the right to touch
You
me.
are under arrest.
I'm under arrest for what?
25,
For what?
7 County FM, 1098,
For what?
290, send me another unit. Get out of the car. Get out of the car now.
Why am I being apprehended? You're trying to give me a ticket
I
for
said
your
get
failure?
out of the car.
Why am I being apprehended? You
I'm
just
giving
opened
you a
my car
lawful order.
door. You just
I'm
opened
gonna
my
drag
car
you
door.
out of here.
So you're threatening to drag me out of my own car.
Get out of the car.
And then you
I will light you up. Get out.
Wow.
Now.
Wow.
Get out of the car.
For a failure to signal. You're doing all of this for a
Get
failure.
over there.
Right, yeah. Yeah, let's take this to court. Let's do
Go ahead.
For a failure to signal. Yep, for a failure to signal.
Get off the phone.
On my stool.
Get off the
I'm not on
phone.
the phone. I have a right
Put
to
your
court.
phone
This is
down.
my property. This
Put
is
your
my
phone
property.
down.
Sir?
Put your phone down. Right now. Put your phone down.
For a fucking failure to signal, my goodness.
Come over here.
Y'all are interested.
Come over here now.
You feeling good about yourself?
Stand right
You
here.
feeling good about yourself?
Stand right there.
For a failure to signal, you feel real good
Turn
about yourself, don't
around.
you?
Turn
You
around.
feel good about yourself,
Turn
don't you?
around now.
What are you?
Put your hands
Why
behind your
am
back
I
and
being
turn around.
arrested?
Turn around.
Why can't you tell me
I'm
why?
giving you a lawful order. I will
Why
tell
am I
you.
being arrested?
Turn
Why
around.
won't you tell me that part?
I'm giving you a lawful order. Turn around.
Why will you not tell me?
You are not
what's going on?
compliant.
I'm not complying because you just pulled me out of my car.
Turn around.
Are you fucking kidding me? This is some bullshit.
Put your hands behind your back.
Because you know this is straight bullshit and you full of shit. Full of straight shit. That's all y'all is, some scary fucking cops. South Carolina got y'all bitch asses scared. That's all it is. Fucking scared of a female.
If you would just listen.
I was trying to sign the fucking ticket. Whatever.
Stop moving.
Are you fucking serious?
Stop moving.
Oh, I can't wait till we go to court. Ooh, I can't wait. I cannot wait till we go to court. I can't wait. Ooh, I can't wait. You want me to sit down now?
No.
Or you gonna throw me to the floor? That'll make you feel better about yourself?
Knock it off.
No, that'll make you feel better about yourself? That make you feel real good, won't it? Pussy ass. Fucking pussy. For a failure signal, you doing all of this. And little ass Prairie View, Texas. My God, they must want to.
You were getting a warning. Until now, you're going to jail.
I'm getting it for what?
You can come
For
read.
what?
Come read right.
I'm getting a warning for what?
Stay right here.
For what? Well, you
Stay
just
right
pointed me over there.
I said stay right
Get
here.
your fucking mouth right. Let me. Oh, I swear on my life, y'all some pussy. A pussy ass cop for a fucking signal. You
I
gonna
got
take
her
me to
control.
jail?
She's in handcuffs.
What a pussy. What a pussy. What a pussy. You got to break my fucking wrist.
Stop moving.
I'm standing still. You
Stay
keep
right
moving
here.
me. God damn it.
Stay right there.
Don't touch me. Fucking pussy for a traffic ticket and all this bullshit. Fucking pussy. For a traffic ticket.
Come read right over here. This right here says a warning. You started creating the problem.
You asked me what was wrong.
Do you have
I'm trying to
anything
tell
on
you.
the person that's
Do
illegal?
it feel like I got anything on me? This a fucking maxi
I'm gonna
dress.
remove your glasses.
This a maxi dress.
Come on over here.
Have on me. Fucking asshole. For a fucking. You're about to break my wrist. Can you stop? You are about to fucking break my wrist. Stop.
Stop now. Stop it.
Stop resisting, man.
If you would stop, then I would tell you.
Fucking traffic
Now
ticket.
stop.
You are such a pussy. You are such a pussy. No, you are.
You're yanking around.
Full traffic signal.
You are yanking around.
Signal.
When you pull away from me, you're resisting arrest.
This makes you feel real good, don't it? A female for a traffic signal.
I got it.
For a traffic signal. I know that makes you feel good, officer.
Take care of yourself.
I know it makes you feel real good. You're a real man now. You just slam me, knock my head in the ground. I got epilepsy, you motherfucker.
Good.
I hope I-
Good.
Good.
Stop that before you start resisting.
All right, yeah, this is real good. Real good for a female, yeah. Y'all strong, ooh. Y'all real strong.
I want you to wait right here. Wait right
I
here.
can't go nowhere with your fucking knee on my back, duh.
I'm gonna open your door. You need to leave. You need to leave. You need to leave. to jail
Whatever.
for resisting arrest. Stand up.
If I could, I
Okay,
can't
roll
even-
over.
I can't even fucking feel my arm.
Tuck your knee in.
Goddamn. I can't.
Listen, you gotta sit up on your butt.
Slam my head into the ground.
Sit
Do
up on
not
your
even
butt.
care about that.
He's telling you to get
I
up.
can't even hear.
Yes, you can.
He
Sit up
slammed
on
my
your butt.
fucking head into the ground.
Sit up on your
What
butt.
the hell?
Now stand up.
All of this for a traffic signal. I swear to God. All of this for a traffic signal. Thank you for recording. Thank you for a traffic signal. Slam me into the ground and everything.
No.
Everything. I hope y'all feel
This officer saw everything.
and I'm so glad to put that you just got on the scene. So whatever.
I
No, you wasn't. You were pulling up. No, you didn't.
No, ma'am.
You didn't see everything leading up to it.
I'm not talking to you.
You don't have to. You don't have to.
2547 county. Good. Send me a person available for arrest.
First available record, Athens 1098, North Justice Right. First available record, Athens 1098, North Justice Right.
Yeah, I'm good. She started yanking away, then kicked me, so I took her straight to the
And
ground.
there you got it right there.
Yeah. Let me see what I'll search it for you if you want.
Yeah.
Okay.
One thing for sure, it's on video.
Yeah.
Hurt? No.
Did you see her when we were right here?
Yeah, I saw the there's that question. Stand there, you know.
I'd like to welcome Tomashi Jackson, Miranda Lash, and Elise Goulandris to the stage. And Maggie Lamb will be coming and collecting your questions. I've never seen that video before. Thank you for showing it to us. For an Athenian audience, to get a little taste of some of the concerns of some of the current, the artists currently working in the United States.
Okay.
Are we on?
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
we're
can-
on.
Cool.
I'm going to step off the stage, and we're going to begin a conversation that is going to be pretty much directed by your questions, which
Yeah.
are going to be arriving on the stage momentarily.
Yeah. So Miranda, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Can you all hear us okay? Yeah.
Thanks for
Yeah.
staying with us through
Thank you.
both of our presentations. I think there was something I forgot to mention. Since being here, we've talked about a lot of things, but some of the things that I've been talking with you about is this feeling of what freedom might feel like, and not realizing that being a Black American I have international friends, but I don't have international family. That I do now. Evharisto. But this, like I've been outside of the United States before, but this, what ARCAthens is doing for us, bringing us here for not quite long enough. Wish it were longer. Yeah, I don't know. We've talked about this. That piece is like really difficult for me to watch. It was really difficult for me to make. It's the only time I've ever felt disabled in the making of something. And I did mention that when Patrick Renner and I were holding those stress positions, it was incredibly hot outside. This was the height of a Texas summer. I wish that we had, that we had been able to properly gauge and chart the temperature of that concrete slab in the backyard of Project Row houses that we were on top of, but our hands and feet were nearly blistered by those endurance poses. And that was nothing compared to doing the editing back at Yale and listening to that over and over and over again. I almost fell down the stairs getting out of the studio building after the night of working on that. And I had to stay in bed for 2 days after that. And the critique was funny because people actually thought that I was going to go back into that and touch it again. I never touched it again. Yeah, so like Miranda helped me choose these videos because I have I have a whole lot of video collages, and she thought it was important to show part of the first one so that there's an understanding of what the fiber work is doing,
Yes.
and what the lip syncing is doing. Which I'm learning about that.
Yeah.
But that the last one was important to show as well. I'm actually interested in finding out more about why you thought these two were important to share with this group of Athenians.
Yeah, well, I think that for a number of reasons. One, I think until I saw the video piece, your video work, I've of course seen you knit and seen examples of the knit work and freestanding sculptures that you saw on the slides, but I didn't realize the power of the performative capability of the knitting work till I saw the video. I also think the second piece especially really brings you very close to the pain and intensity of experienced by Sandra Bland, who I think you mentioned was found dead in her cell 2 days after arrest.
Yeah, after that was that's the last recording
within 2 days
of her
after arrest. And
alive.
you know, I think as a curator, and I know as an artist, you have to be selective about when you allow that kind of intensity to be presented to audiences, but sometimes a measure of that intensity is needed, especially when an audience might not be familiar with all the variables. Only like maybe not everyone here knows the story of Sandra Bland. And sometimes bringing that forth can be important. And we've talked a lot in our conversations about the importance of art acknowledging certain phenomena, the role of art in acknowledging certain phenomenon, which people know about, but it's not explicitly acknowledged or registered in an official capacity. So, for example, in your work, you talk about the devastation wrought by the crack cocaine epidemic in Los Angeles, which many people in the U.S. understand happened, but there's never been a formal acknowledgement by the U.S. government that this took place, that it was a concerted effort that wrecked the lives of countless of people. And to me, I'm really, interested in the role of the artist in filling a void of formal acknowledgement when it doesn't exist. And also sensitive to the role it takes, to the toll it takes on you, Tomashi. I mean, you talked about this desire for freedom in the wake of creating work like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We've also, it's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just gonna get the pointer in case we want to look at anything
Sure,
else.
yeah.
When people's cards are coming in, they're coming in. It's very exciting. Just in case there's something else we need to go back to by request. Freedom or something like it. Democracy or something like it.
Yeah.
Elise is so incredibly, heartbreakingly brilliant, and the time that we've spent walking through the archaeological sites with her, I can't even express. I haven't even fully processed how illuminating it's been, but like the ideals, because like we're fed these ideals in the United States in school. I'm not one, although my family was definitely devastated by that epidemic. I have not. I came out of it all not wanting for proper education. So, in my public and private education, there's always this, the notion of democracy is on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And it's funny that in my phone I had that picture holding the souvenirs that we bought from our first trip to the Acropolis because the Parthenon is upside down. And that's what I've been thinking about, and feeling, well, all the time, is that we live in an upside down world. Where these we're told this rhetoric, but what I actually experience, what I actually experience is something else.
Yeah.
And around this topic of mythology, rhetorical mythology,
Yes.
I was really interested in your work on mythologies of the South in that regard.
Yeah, I think we both have this huge fascination being here with the origins of Athenian democracy, not because we believe it,
It's perfect.
It wasn't not because we believe it's perfect, but because the mythology, as it translates to the United States as the birthplace for their ideas, carries a lot of weight. And it doesn't mean it was an accurate translation or transcription. The way it was translated into U.S. context as we've talked about, is deeply flawed. But it's always fascinating to me to go back to where the origin myths started in terms of the U.S. context of how democracy is represented. So I think that's why we love walking around the Agora, why we're going to walk around the Pnyx.
Where voting actually took place.
Where voting
really
actually
important
took
place for me
place.
to go.
Yeah.
So it looks like, how are you all doing? You guys okay? You all okay?
Yeah.
You don't have a microphone. Can we have one? Okay. All right. So we're going to get into it. This is guided by you. Thank you for participating with us in this way.
Is this on?
Is
it working?
on?
Yes?
We are a part of a rhythm.
Okay, so I just wanted to see the questions before coming up here because, well, there's a lot of them, for one. And also, I think I can kind of divide them into two packs. There's, in the sense that there's a bunch of questions here that are about advice, like practical advice for a young artist, young curator. That's one sort of set of questions. And then the other ones, well, let's see. Many of them are similar in nature, but, oh, more coming.
Thanks.
Okay.
What'd I tell you?
Yeah, many of them are similar in nature, but in overall, I think this one here might cover what this pack sort of is about. But so social issues appear to be a major part of your work, both of your works. And the question is, what are sort of the dominant social issues that you have seen here in Athens? And how might they, how do they relate to your work? Might you incorporate them into your work?
Yeah, do you want to talk?
I want you to start.
Okay,
You've been having all these incredible
yeah,
studio visits and conversations.
Yeah, I've had really wonderful studio visits. I'm going to do more, want to do more. I wouldn't say that they're dominant. I should say maybe there are common areas, but not to imply that every artist is interested in similar things. I feel like the refugee crisis and the phenomenon of refugees being pulled out of Athens and put in camps has come up repeatedly. I've talked with a lot of artists about the role of different neighborhoods in Athens, the role of Exarchia, for example, as a place that is being, where refugees are being pulled out of has come up a lot. The role of Greece as the gateway for a number of these refugees, and what that means, for example, people coming in on boats in Lesbos, but also what it means for Athenians in terms of people living here or in the detention camps. I feel like that's come up a lot. Talked with a number of artists about gender issues. What does it mean to be a feminist here? What does it mean to support people who are transgendered? That's come up a lot. And also the aftermath of the economic crisis. Like, what is it, and also the aftermath in positive and negative ways from Documenta. I feel that has to be acknowledged too. To me, it's a really interesting time to be here 2 years after Documenta. And actually, I'm really happy to be here 2 years after Documenta, although I didn't get to see the actual event, because I feel like from my experience seeing a biennial pop up in New Orleans, 2 years after a major art world phenomenon is when you actually, I feel like, can start to get a read on what were the lasting effects and what did it mean for artists, and what are sort of the takeaways. You can start to get a sense of what the takeaways were from a big project like that. So that's just skimming the surface. There was a lot more, but that's skimming the surface.
There's a question coming. Coming.
Yeah. Tomashi, thoughts as far as what you've been hearing and
yeah, I guess I've been hearing about the same things because we have been together a lot also.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm thinking about the part of the question about like how being here may influence.
Yeah, I should have
the
answered
work.
that, but yes, you go first. Yeah.
Yeah, we need to move on to another question.
No, not at all. And specifically, sort of, some of the issues and the political issues
Yes.
that you're picking up on and that have reference to your own work and that might feed your own work in the future.
I want to be really. I feel like being really sensitive and careful about my words around that, just because I haven't been here very long, and people are going through a lot, and there's, you know, as the research-based nature of my work like shows, like I actually like want to be clear and accurate about these human histories. But I've been relating a lot to narratives of relearning, like what you all have been telling us about. Well, just like this a distinctly Greek history inside of Europe of enduring all of these invasions and surviving as a people, and then this economic crisis that the people of Greece have been enduring. I've been thinking a lot about the economic crisis, the Great Recession in the United States, and how we haven't actually recovered. One of our early conversations with Elise, while we were walking around somewhere, she was talking about how this country is still reeling from the effects of what happened. It's actually not over. And unlike the United States, and I was like, well, it depends on what neighborhood you're from. It depends on who you are in the United States, because there are whole Black and brown communities that just don't exist anymore. Black property ownership, I can't recall the exact percentage, but it's some like horrific number, like in the 90s, of the reduction of Black property ownership. There were more Black property owners during the Jim Crow era in the United States than what's happening right now. And so, you know, that in my hometown, I was born in Texas, but I grew up in Los Angeles. In my hometown of Los Angeles, there are people living in tent cities. Like these are legislated, policy-oriented crises that have been created in my experience, where I'm from. Like the gutting of affordable housing legislation and policies. Literally, people who are working, people who have families. These aren't people who are living on Skid Row who were turned out by a drug epidemic. These are like families with kids and bikes and jobs who are living in tent cities all across California. So I'm also, I don't know. But the energy here is so alive and so beautiful. I mean, like, New York City is being like just chopped apart. Like the vibe that made people want to be in New York City as a place where all of us could collide and then like go back to wherever our homes were and come back again, where our contemporary understanding of a vibrant artistic culture from the eastern seaboard of the United States has just been chopped up by these same sort of inhumane policies. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that's affected me the most is fantasizing about leaving the United States and imagining like what a life, like imagining a freedom. I think my exact words were a freedom from the notion that that's the only place that I can end up, a place that shows me over and over again how much it hates me. So no matter how much, you know, I'm doing well. Like I also like live a very good life, but like I'm also like very aware that it could be me at any time. So yeah. Can we have another?
Well, since it's on the subject of displacement, moving a little bit, but any thoughts on displacement of people in Athens? Exarchia, because of Airbnb. People come for the culture, and local people, including artists, are displaced.
Exarchia's, we could talk about that. I mean, Exarchia has come up a lot, actually, in my conversations with artists. I think gentrification throughout the U.S. is, and its adverse effects on artists are a huge problem. And Tomashi and I have talked about this extensively, like the need for cities to either impose rent controls or spaces that artists can still live and work.
And families also, because it's like there have also always been artists in all these places. Like there's this language of like this redevelopment language in the United States is that you have what they'll call a no man's land, where impoverished people have been or underserved communities have been, post-desegregation, starving of the city centers of resources, and that artists will go where other people won't go,
Yes.
and then they make the place cool, and then development follows, like luxury development follows. But my argument has always been that there have always been artists in all of these places,
Yes.
among families.
Yeah,
When
yeah.
I lived in San Francisco for 3 years, my grandparents had a home there for 40 years. I remember a black and brown and Asian Pacific Islander, a thoroughly culturally, ethnically diverse San Francisco, and economically diverse San Francisco. And there were like, elders and little children and babies, children playing in the street, and artists among all of us. I dropped out of school and learned from those people.
Yeah.
And live there as a part of that community. This weaponizing of artistic productive culture as like what attracts displacement development, and then what also causes displacement development is like extremely disturbing. I'm sorry I jumped in like that.
No. So it's something I think about a lot in terms of like, so what does that mean for a museum? Does a museum become a place to talk about this? How does it affect the way we compensate artists if we know that like their places of work are being endangered? Airbnb was a big issue in New Orleans as well.
Completely wiping out
Yeah.
communities.
And, on the subject of displacement, I've thought a lot about, to my shame, there are detention camps, large-scale detention camps in the U.S. on the U.S.-Mexico border. Maybe many of you know this, where, until there are phenomenon of parents being separated from children.
And now the children are being quietly adopted out while their parents have been deported.
Yeah, and toddlers having to testify for themselves in court. But there are, in the U.S., artists wanting to address this, just as there are artists in Greece wanting to address this subject matter. And I've thought about what kind of context can we provide to bring these dialogues together so that it's not just American artists by themselves trying to figure this out and Greek artists by themselves trying to figure this out, but like what are lessons we can learn from each other. So I've been thinking about that a lot.
So keeping it on Athens for now. To Tomashi, during your stay here, did you meet the black community in Athens?
I was invited to a reggae festival by a black man who spotted me on the Acropolis. Yeah,
On our way.
but we
yeah.
didn't get to go. Like we've actually had a really packed schedule, so I didn't get to go to that. I have had the good fortune of being like taken under the young and vibrant wing of a brilliant young Black Greek artist who has opened up his studio space to me and worked with me on one of the love song videos that I made, and he took me to his neighborhood, and we were talking about that. So we were talking about like where Black people are. And I've been really interested in that because, of course, in the back of my mind, I'm fantasizing, like, what if I could actually leave the United States? What if I could actually, like, have part of my life be here? What if I could come here and contribute to this community, too? Like, not as a tourist, but, like, I don't know, tax-paying, pay taxes all over the world, whatever. Whatever that means. I don't know what it means yet. I don't know what it means because, like, I'm like woefully. I think of myself as woefully American in that regard. Like my best friend is a Black Caribbean woman whose family is from the islands, and that was one of the first stamps outside on my passport was to go to their nation. I'm like, wow, could be other places, but. Yeah, so I don't feel like I missed a party. We went to Egina and came back, and I was too exhausted to go to this this African fashion show we were invited to. So I'm embarrassed to say that that the opportunities for assembly that I've been invited to I've missed. But something that Demos and I were talking about when we were over in his hood was the absence of Black shopkeepers, of African shopkeepers. He was telling me that since during the economic crisis, they all went bankrupt and they had to fold up and leave, or they no longer exist, because there were certain things that I was like, I could use a do-rag, for Tommy. Oh, the character's name is Tommy Tonight, the love song singing lad that has emerged this summer. Totally unexpected again. But Demos and I went shopping for clothes so I can make some love song music videos in different places. And there were other things that I thought I might need, and there was nowhere to get them. He was telling me that like certain things that he needs as a Black man, he has to order online because those shopkeepers don't exist anymore. So a part of my desire to come back, to stay longer, or how to use my next few weeks is to actually to find out more. I understand that, there are some African cultural centers, a couple, that I'm seeking out. So, thanks for asking that question.
Yeah. Okay, well, these three, I think, should sort of be read together. They're, again, all for Tomashi.
What?
We'll get to Miranda. I guess... So, obviously, like, this is my commentary now, but that, your work is, showing a reality that I think is for, people here is a bit, it's a U.S. reality, right? So take this, take these questions in this light.
It's not lost on me that white supremacist fascism is an international phenomenon. I'm just because I haven't been here, I don't want to, I want to be careful not to like impose like the perspective that's born of this regular trauma. I'm also recognizing being able to be here. Actually, our time at the Desde Foundation was really eye-opening. There was a show, Dreams and Trauma, that has an amazing catalog with all these amazing Greek artists from the collection in this show. The text from that, I wish I'd brought the book with me to read from it, but being here is helping me to realize that I'm like deeply traumatized, and that my work keeps responding to that. And so when I imagine the possibility of freedom here, I'm imagining like what might be on the other side of being like constantly re-triggered into having to respond to this over and over and over again. Like, what would my work be if I were free?
I feel like you're already answering these questions, but I'm just going to read them, because they have been asked. So, your art presents a U.S. that still seems to live in the Jim Crow era. Obviously, race matters have dramatically progressed since then. What about violence of African Americans against their own, which is also a frequent phenomenon? Why not focus on other issues that African Americans or people of other races face as human beings and not as people of color? I'm going to keep reading.
Okay.
Are the police allowed to arrest you without committing a crime?
Yes.
Well, they're not supposed to. They're but yes, they do.
Yeah.
They do. But they're
And
technically.
then finally, what can we
also
learn?
we learn that things are okay when there's no recourse. So if there's no real recourse, then you learn that you're allowed.
Yes.
And then what can we learn from the Black Lives Matter movement, and how can the audience be educated here, the audience here?
Oh gosh, what a trio. Will you help me?
Yeah.
Well, we've talked a lot about education and like what we think we know about ourselves and the world, about and how education arrives in front of us through like a nationally oriented agendas. And how there are all these questions these things that should come up, like about like people of the world, or what I've come to I've come to like focus a lot on a selective humanism. I focus on these things because I'm aggravated by them. I'd rather not be aggravated. I consider it an imposition. Like I've talked with you about this too. That I consider visual language, formal visual language, to be my first language. It's the way that my earliest art teachers understood me. It's the way that, when I was 6, the people who were my art teachers in my public magnet school, that was the product of that the effort to desegregate schools, like the funding for arts in the United States, public-facing cultural institutions, the National Endowment for the Arts, Humanities and Sciences, public broadcasting, huge surges of funding happened in an effort to participate, in an effort to push forward the an integrated Great Society. This is the Great Society legislation. But like there's so much that we growing up in the United States, that we're beneficiaries of like bloody battles for like full human citizenship, and we have no clue. We don't know the story. It's not even presented, like we're presented again, like this myth of democracy, this myth of like a melting pot. Now there are textbooks floating around the United States talking about how indigenous people who were massacred moved out. They voluntarily moved out. And the enslaved people who were working coerced, who were laboring coerced by violence, raped and tortured and mutilated, that they were voluntary workers. This is the language in children's textbooks.
Yeah.
So like there is a complex of like policy-oriented decisions. And I should also disclaimer, my best friend, that Caribbean woman, is a policy analyst and researcher. So our last 20 years of friendship has really influenced the way that I seek out to complete these questions. I had these questions, I always had these questions about why things were the way they were, but being with, hanging out with Nia, as she does her work in education policy and now economic policy, I realized that there are whole documented narratives around around actual policies and legislation that we are all governed by and that do impact the world. That this is, it's not just my family or my neighborhood or my community, where we do take care of each other. Like that's always happening. That's always happening. But something that I remain interested in is understanding narratives that have been like woefully incomplete. So some of the things that we've been talking about is how maybe some things come up in high school that tickle your interest. Like, that seems like an incomplete story. And then maybe you go to college and then you have the opportunity to seek out, to seek to really answer those questions, but you have to go for it, And I think that's kind of, there's something really wrong about that to me, that there's like an international history of human contribution to the human narrative that in its incomplete narration, that a selective notion of humanism becomes more and more tolerable and normalized, and then we just go on. And these things happen, and I know for a lot of us, it will feel like the weather, like a storm, like it's just like falling from the sky. But like there are patterns to be observed, and I feel like it's important for us to. It's not a given that one is just going to go to college or graduate school and seek that stuff out. I mean, there's certain classes that I had in graduate school. By the time my second graduate program, by the time I got to Yale, I was like, wow, I totally didn't even have to end up in this classroom. I didn't think I was going to, I wasn't planning after MIT to 2 years later apply to Yale for painting and printmaking, and I ended up in this amazing class with Kobina Mercer, a historian that people should know, a Black British queer art historian that just completely blew my mind. He wrote an essay every week. His introduction to us every week was an essay that he had just written that I couldn't capture fast enough. But he was talking about Europe. He was talking about the Windrush generation. He was talking about the rebuilding of Great Britain after World War II and who did that. He was talking about. I was like, why haven't I heard this before?
Yeah, well, but I feel like one of the questions was, what can we learn from Black Lives Matter? And something you and I talk about a lot is the importance of coalition building. And actually, I think something we both feel very strongly is that, and I've had to learn the hard way, frankly, is that when something is bothering you and when you want to take on something, don't do it alone. And it's really important to identify other creative producers or people in your community who are interested in doing it with you. And one of the takeaways from Black Lives Matter has been the role of a concerted, organized effort in bringing awareness. And I know that's something you talk about as well, Tomashi, is finding like-minded people and taking proactive stance with them. And
that's even sketchy because like-minded. What does that even mean? Like if so many of us are mutually under-informed about each other's human value.
sure, the idea. But I think the point of not trying to do it by yourself. Is important. And I mean that even in terms of. Even in terms of the U.S. context, I think so often the U.S. is enamored with the idea that our experience is very unique. We're such a big country that we just, I don't know, I think we float around thinking no one does it like America, blah, blah. And it's
rhetoric.
And it's very helpful actually to be put in an international context, to realize that there are shared problems. And again, get out of the idea that we have to solve it all by ourselves and that we can't pull on creative voices from other places.
And scholarly voices. I mean, I think it's good to have friends who don't do the same thing. It's been really, really important for me to have friends who are scientists and who are researchers and who are focused on matters of English, of language, writers, architects, that we all bring different things, that we enlighten each other with the things that we don't know. I would encourage people to, if people who like book lists are really good. The Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. by Claiborne Carson. I didn't even know this book existed until Nia shared it with me. It's a collection of his writings, of his work domestically and internationally, that were collected after his murder and published in 1998. And Dark Alliance was a really important book for me to understand what happened to us in Los Angeles. And what happened to us in Los Angeles and eventually all these other urban city centers in the United States is being looked to now as an opioid crisis has swept the entire country. So I think reading is good.
Reading is important. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to shift gears simply because there's appear to be a lot of aspiring young artists and curators in the audience.
I swear, that's that and love songs, the things that make me happy. Nothing makes me happier than young people who want to keep making art. My God.
Okay, so here's a couple for Miranda. What's the most difficult part of your job? What piece of advice would you give a young curator? And how about this one? Would you curate an exhibition you don't believe in? An artist you don't appreciate or like?
Wait, sorry, can you say the end of that last one? Yeah.
Would you curate an exhibition you don't believe in? Would you curate an artist you don't appreciate or like?
Oh, wow. These are great questions. Let me start with the advice for the young curator. I think that, so let's say you find a context to curate, and I don't want to cause trouble by saying this, but usually you're given parameters as a curator, and that's good, that's important, especially within a museum. There are reasons for parameters, but I also think it's important to generate ideas that I don't want to say defy these parameters, but think more expansively and at least see if they're possible. And I say this to young curators. Don't wait for let's just say those site-specific commissions I did with from the rooftop with Swoon. The museum never told me, hey, it'd be great. Can you suspend something from the ceiling with a street artist? The museum never proposed that to me. They never specifically asked me to do that. I think it was a dialogue that I was willing to have with the museum of can we do this? And my advice to a young curator is, when you're generating the ideas, don't be afraid to think a bit more expansively about what's possible and propose it. All they can say is no. But it's a mistake to sort of take a passive role and say, okay, they want 5 things, I'm gonna find 5 things, that's the end. It can be more, and sometimes you'd be surprised when you bring enough passion to an idea, how much more flexibility there is. I don't advocate going and flying in the face in defiance of your institution, because the institution's your host. But I think if you are willing to have the patience for dialogue with an institution, you'd be surprised where you can find wiggle room, I guess is what I'm saying. And as a young curator, I think that's really important, because I would say, above all, I don't care if you're young or old, your job is to advocate for your artists, and your job is to present their work in the truest way possible, in a way that honors their vision. And so doing that sometimes requires a push-pull relationship with your institution, and finding where those spaces are. And you won't know till you try. Which kind of segues to the most difficult part of my job, which sometimes is being that liaison. It's being the go-between between institutional structures, funding. I love my funders. I love you. But being the liaison between these variables and the artist, and because it's a tightrope walk sometimes. It's a negotiation. It's an ongoing dialogue. And actually, a mentor figure of mine, Bill Fagley, who's a part of ARCAthens Advisory Committee,
President of the board.
President of the board, Bill. He's a huge inspiration to me as a curator, and again, without trying to inspire trouble in the audience, he always told me, don't take no as the first answer, use your powers of persuasion, charisma, advocacy, education as tools in your toolbox for trying to help realize the artist's voice. And then I think the last question was, would I ever do a show I don't believe in? Well, so I feel like I won't name the show. I won't name the show. Would I ever do a show with an artist whose work I truly detested, that I felt no common ground with? No. That said, though, sometimes you're asked to do projects where you're not super excited about it for one reason or another. There have been a couple occasions where I've been asked to do this, and in the calculus of the other projects I had going on, I'd feel like, I'll be honest and say, I knew that doing this project would enable me to do other projects. And so for example, showing an artist whose work I would consider more conservative enabled me to do a project with an artist whose work was not at all on any level conservative, but they served different audiences. The audience that wanted to see this art that I will not name, it catered to their tastes, and it brought in different people through the door, and it provided my museum with funding that floated the overall operating cost of the institution, which enabled me to do something else. Now, that said, I've had countless talks with colleagues about where's that line, where's that line you won't cross, that you just won't, and I think it's a really case-by-case thing. If you have no integrity for your work, people sense that, and honestly, more bad projects come to you, because they're like, she'll do it, So I think it's a really careful calculation you have to make. What are you willing to compromise on? I feel like, we've talked about the importance in negotiations of never going in without demands. And so if you do say yes to something, I always feel like, okay, but this means, and therefore we're gonna do this. I'm gonna do this, but we're gonna do this, And so I feel like that's the best way I've been able to navigate it. Yeah.
I'm gonna miss you.
I want to see you, Tomashi.
There's one more question that's for Miranda. Maybe we'll ask that one before we move on to Tomashi, even though we're running out of time. How do you approach a foundation when you ask for funding? And what's the best way to present an idea or a concept?
How do I approach a foundation for funding? So sometimes it's in grant form, like literally writing a grant, to the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. Sometimes it's a person-to-person. There's a contact at a foundation. I asked if we can have a meeting, and it's a face-to-face thing. The commonality between both contexts, I would say, is in a way conveying the most important, distilling the most compelling parts of your project in the briefest and clearest way possible. So in other words, when you're approaching a foundation or any funder, you have to assume time is very precious. I never go in assuming that I'll have more than 15 minutes. If I get more than 15 minutes, I'll be so happy. But go in assuming that's all you have. And that means you really have to spend time distilling what, like, not just what's most important to me, what's most important to them. So in other words, if it's a foundation whose priority is education, you have to highlight the educational components of the project. If the foundation, their priority is supporting LGBT artists, then that's something you have to emphasize. And so it's also recognizing what is going to be compelling to a supporter. And also, this is so cheesy, but have you ever seen the TED Talk on power poses?
No.
Okay, this is, if you want to feel more confident when you're approaching someone, they actually advocate going into the restroom and exercising, making your body feel bigger, like literally putting your hands up, like in the air and coming in with confidence. It does help. And also, a really great museum director told me once, don't ever be bashful about asking for money, because remember, you're not asking for yourself. Mm-hmm. I'm not asking for a personal loan for me. I'm asking for the artist. And if you believe in what you're doing, there's no reason to feel shy or that you don't deserve to ask or that it's an imposition. You're asking for something that I believe is one of the most important causes in the world. So why should I be shy? Why should I hide that I care about it? And so that was really helpful advice. Yeah.
Let's take one or two more questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, I'm just gonna move to Tomashi because there are questions related to advice for young artists, including what is your opinion about participation fees in an exhibition?
Participation. I don't know if I know what that is. I mean, we received artist fees from the Whitney. I don't know.
No, the question is, do you, participation fees, like
that's
that
what
when
I'm
an
talking
artist
about.
has to pay.
Oh, when an artist has to pay?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
The artist paying
To show. I have heard of that. I mean, I think it depends. Because there was a small gallery in New York that I don't think even exists anymore. Mm-hmm. It might not exist anymore. But I know that a part of their ability to remain open for as long as they did and to publish a magazine, which they did for a long time, was because they provided a space that people could. I don't know how it all happened, but people did pay fees to show there, and so people who otherwise had not ever shown it doesn't even feel right coming out of my mouth. But if it's this, and there's a question I didn't fully answer before about Black communities and what we do with and for each other and about each other under these conditions. And I'm thinking about this in the same house of collective economics and a communal effort. So there were so many small organizations in the Bay, and there continue to be. I mean, it's a site for a revolutionary community movement in the United States. So I saw this a lot when I was very young there. People want to go in on a space. The space has to be paid for. There are many different ways that people can figure out how to make that happen. A space that is meant for community members to participate. I feel like my words are just dropping all over the place. Boston Ujima Project is a really good example. It's my best friend's organization. Mm-hmm. There's an article about the economic ecosystem that they're creating on Forbes. If you were to Google Boston Ujima Project Forbes, it's going to be the first article that comes up. It's not the best, but it is one of the really good ones that explains their economic ecosystem. So I'm thinking I want to think hyper positive about what it could mean to participate in a show in a space. I'm thinking that the person maybe they're talking about a space inside of Greece, under conditions of economic duress. So Boston Ujima Project is arising out of Boston, which is notoriously insanely normatively racist, and so the goal of the United States' first democratic economic investment funds with the sole purpose of funding businesses that otherwise historically do not have access to formal streams of capital to start and maintain small businesses. Indigenous people, brown people, black people that are left in the communities in Boston. And there's research about this from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, also going back to that other question, like there's like facts about the targeted nature of these sort of disparities. So I'm thinking about what I've seen come out of communities, under-resourced communities, and how people will collectively make decisions that do require other people put in. So like Boston Ujima Project, everybody has to put in at least $50 to be a member, and then you can vote on what businesses get funded by what will eventually be a $5 million fund, for example. So if it's a community gallery, if it's a collective gallery where like everybody puts in some money to show, and so there can be refreshments, there can be, there can be paint to patch the walls, you can pay the rent, you can mop the floor. I think that's actually a worthwhile endeavor.
Yeah.
But if it's something that feels exploitative, I would question it.
I would just say, because there are juried shows in the U.S. where you have to pay to enter a juried, yeah.
Have to pay to apply to things. I
put
put in money.
Yeah.
I put in money to apply to Skowhegan, which for the young artists in the room, it's an international residency. Please, please, please apply. It's a very magical place. It's been there since 1946. But the first window of opportunity to apply, it's like, what, like $20 or maybe $15. I don't know what that is in euros because of the exchange rate. And then at another time, after that window closes, the second part of the application time, open time, it'll go up to like $25 or $40. And then at the very end, right before it closes, it'll be at its most expensive, which will be like $80. And that money goes to the school.
Yeah.
So I have paid the $80 fee.
Yeah.
But I appreciate where the money's going.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, I guess the one brief thing I would say is if you're contemplating whether it's worth spending the money for a show, don't just think of it as carving out money. If you're going to go through the expense, also plan in advance to carve out time if you get in the show to maximize the opportunities. So in other words, plan to dedicate time to invite people to see it, reach out to curators, reach out to press, blah, blah. Basically do everything you can so that if you paid the fee and the art goes on the wall, you're actually maximizing that opportunity, which doesn't end with getting it on the wall.
Was that good? Are they still here? Whoever answered that? Whoever asked that?
Okay, if we can answer this in 2 minutes, I think
We
we
can.
should ask.
We can do it.
Okay, so
And then we can
Tomashi,
go outside and smoke
so
cigarettes
for
and keep
an
talking.
artist, what is the best way to present yourself and to present your work? And what is the procedure of making an exhibition? Do you approach a gallery or does the gallery approach you? And what about costs?
Oh boy. Is this person still here? Because sometimes people ask questions on cards and then they leave. And hi, I'm Tomashi. What's your name? Jordan? George, nice to meet you. Thanks for the question. I think I'll answer as much of this as I can, and then as they kick us out, we can talk outside on those nice benches they have. Oh, there's wine.
There's wine. There's wine.
Okay. Well, cool. Well, relax. Oh boy. So how do you present yourself, and how do you show? When I was very young, I approached people. I was aggressive. Like I went to shows. In the first place that I went after I graduated high school in Los Angeles was San Francisco. Had a very vibrant art community. I won't just say artists, but again, the ecosystem. When I suggest you look at Boston Ujima Project, it's to really like jump into the reality of like a multifaceted ecosystem, like the Agora, like what we saw at the, like spaces for assembly, spaces for presentation, spaces for voting and leadership. And in that spirit, I would encourage you to start imagining spaces for yourself. I actually want to start with that, as opposed to like how you present yourself to others and get them to do what you want, get them to take your work seriously and do what you want them to do. Whoever your friends are who are also thinking about space and showing, I would start there with like envisioning like what your ideal is, like what your expectations are together, and then how to like make a space where you all can support each other. So there were spaces like that when I was like 19 and I dropped out of school. So I like hung out with those people. I hung out with graffiti heads. I hung out with people who put on like incredible shows, incredible parties, DJs coming in from all over the world. It was the spot. It was a good time. I was actually very interested in having a good time. While taking my work very seriously in my studio/bedroom, I was like a part of this community that was multifaceted, so I had something to offer in certain situations that other people didn't have. So like when the spoken word poets who were working with the DJs to put on like this big fashion show on a monthly basis, like a regular show that was called Fabric at the time, when they were thinking about how do we bring visual art into this, because hip hop is actually, this was like a really golden time for hip hop in the Bay, and hip hop is elemental. Hip hop is visual culture, it's MCing, it's DJing, it's breakdancing. So, the DJs and the MCs are gonna bring all the dancers, but then the question would often come up, how do we spotlight visual art? How do we spotlight visual culture? And I was there. They'd be like, Tomashi, do something, do something. So then I started like painting live at shows. And then I started giving the work away. I was in the middle of a block after I dropped out of school. I didn't know what to paint or why. And I remember thinking that was the missing link, kind of like Tommy Tonight, kind of like these love songs, lip syncing these love songs keep showing up as a mystery missing link. At the time, I remember thinking, I'm in a block, I don't know what to do. I should be generous. I should be generous. I should give it away. I'm not encouraging people to give away their work. This is just like where my head was at the time. So then suddenly, it felt like magic when I was asked to come and paint live. And so I came with an agenda. My agenda was studio-oriented, and I put together like this big tapestry of colored paper from the art supply store that I worked at, and I painted all night. And as the night went on, people came up and would talk to me, and I would meet people, and I would just give them things. I wanted to practice radical generosity with my work at the time. And it opened up. I made all these really good paintings in the studio after that ended up getting picked up by a gallery and sold. The whole show sold out. I was like 20 years old in San Francisco, another gallery that doesn't exist anymore. So I'm actually like really concerned about these economic landscapes, these hostile economic landscapes that we're existing in, and how we protect each other and move through them as artists who are members of families and part of larger communities. And thinking about longevity, I don't really know what the answer to that is, except that we have to like be working together to figure out what spaces that aren't just showing up to like take like what that looks like. And I don't know what the answer is for y'all, but I'm looking forward to seeing what your answers are. When I had my first studio visit with my gallerist who passed away a couple of years ago, Jack Tilton, so many of my dreams had come true at that point, like unexpectedly. So many of my dreams had come true at that point. It's important for me to have dreams to like to be able to recognize when they're happening. And I remember waking up the morning of that studio visit and thinking like, wait a minute, I don't have like a want. I don't know what I want, you know? Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know what I want. He'd heard about my work. He came all the way up to New Haven to see me. And I kind of like envisioned in my head, Eris and all of us were talking about positive visioning. Like, what is it? And positive visualization, that's really important. And I remember thinking, like, what do I want? I want a show. I want him to offer me a show. What do I want at the end of this? I want him to offer me a show. I want him to offer me representation. Did not know this man. But I knew that he was like historically like a really important gallerist, a good gallerist, who came from a very distinct history of showing abstract expressionist work. Well, discovering people, but having come from this history of abstract expressionism in the New York painting school of the 50s and 60s under the tutelage of Betty Parsons. And I pictured it, and at the end he ended up like how I presented myself. I wore my grandmother's dress. That's really one of the only things that I have from my grandmother. The button comes all the way up to here, so there was like no opportunity for me to even like slouch. I thought about those little things because I have really bad posture. I have the posture of a visual artist. I have the posture of a child who like was always like this, drawing pictures, right? So like I did little things. Like I made sure that I bathed and I smelled good. As far as like personal presentation, and then I showed the best work that I could show. I got space in the school to put up all the work that I had made that couldn't all fit in the studio, and we had a good conversation, and And he ended up giving me his card at the end and asking me how long it would take for me to make a show. And that was my first show my first solo show in New York was after I graduated after that. That also means like my experience after, I'm in my 30s at this point when this is happening. So I'm kind of like trying to draw on both of these experiences of like being out there and hungry to relate to yours. Because things can happen all kinds of different ways. Like we don't all have the exact same story. But one thing that is consistent, I think, is that like working with people, maintaining friendships with people who write. It's important to know people who write. Whoever your friends are, who are really interested in language. I picked that up from my friend Eric and Mac, actually. Because when he was at Yale, he made friends with art historians, and he was like, it's really important to get down with the people who are going to be the future writers of our history. I do the work that I do because I believe that art history is social history. I think like the notion that there's some sort of like non-political place in art history is absurd because we're talking about things that people have done, and people are governed by policies in the world. There's no way around that. So like be good to people, be good to yourself and be good to people, and read and be interested. Go to the Desde Foundation and ask them to open up their periodical library. You know, desire to be the writers of the next history for Greek contemporary art. You know, like you're in it. You're it. It's you.
It's you.
It's you already. And the spaces that you all make together will make it so like we won't be able to help but buy that $5 million ticket to come back here and see what you're doing.
Yeah.
And then, because then like you create that, and then people will come to you, people who have a vision for like how to push your contemporary art scene, to push you all further. They're around. You have like people who love art in this place that we've met, and don't just like love art as a commodity. They love it. Like we visited collectors who love work. Don't make it themselves. They love the work. You know. So like I think imagining. You know, it's like I feel like the space that we have to make art and share art is like it's like the salve on my soul in the middle of all this madness that we're all enduring. So I would encourage you to be like hyper positive, like very inform yourself. Like whatever is happening with economic policy around here, locally, nationally, internationally, know that. Get to know it. Form some study groups with your friends who are also like willing to actually like print out some PDFs of real documents about real stuff and inform yourselves, and at the same time be super positive about making a space that will attract other people who will want to help push your vision forward as a visual artist.
Well,
we're getting kicked out now.
Yes. We're not getting kicked out. We're moving next door for all of you that can stay for a glass of wine, and maybe you can talk a little more. To our fellows, Tomashi Jackson and Miranda Lash, thank you so much for doing this.